Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented in the 18th week of 2014 by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook, and it's April 29th. On this day in 1910, the British Parliament passed the People's Budget, the first budget in British history with the expressed intent of redistributing wealth among the British people. People today are drawing parallels between the international situation now and that in those years just before World War I. It's important to remember that what was going on in Europe and in the U.S. in the years before World War I was nothing less than a press for socialism. The People's Budget in the UK and the rise of socialism in Europe and the U.S. are the important background to the First World War. In the U.S., the same Democratic president who maneuvered an anti-war public into the European war, Woodrow Wilson, also imprisoned and exiled American socialists in the Palmer raids, ravaged the Caribbean, and resegregated the federal government. The First World War was largely an attempt to suppress these social movements in the U.S. and in Europe. War is the health of the state, wrote an insightful commentator in 1918, and an essay worth reading in a modern neoliberal administration. Our program is about terrorism and what can be done to combat it. It's hard for Americans to admit that by far the greatest terrorist campaign in the world today is being run by the Obama administration, not by those we usually call terrorists. War is the health of the state. U.S. terrorism is not just Obama's drone strikes, which have killed almost 5,000 people, including 200 children. It's also the activities of the U.S. Special Operations Command, essentially the president's private army of some 70,000 people, who are active, according to their spokesman, in more than 130 countries around the world. Their activities include kidnapping, which we call rendition, torture, and murder. It's part of the policies pursued by this and earlier administrations that have plagued the world with war and destruction, not to protect U.S. citizens, it doesn't do that, but for the profits of the tiny American economic elite, the 1%, who've gotten 95% of the income gains in the Obama years. This is the real source, for example, of U.S. support for Israel's crimes, which would be impossible without the military, economic, and diplomatic support of the United States. The most important factor is that Israel is a stationary aircraft carrier for U.S. military control of the greatest energy-producing region of the world, a cynosure of American foreign policy. Control, and not just access to these energy resources, is what the U.S. has demanded for generations. It gives indirect but politically critical leverage on the European and Asian economies that are also dependent on energy exports from the region, as Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a few years ago. All U.S. administrations have been willing to kill a lot of people to secure that sort of control of energy, and all Israeli governments have been willing accomplices, as the world recognizes. Now Obama's project seems to be to seize Ukraine, kick Moscow out of the Sevastopol base in the Crimea, and thus from the Eastern Mediterranean, and then take over Syria, so Qatar, and not Iran, Iraq, and Syria, may get its share of oil flows from the Middle East via Jordan and a Sunni-ruled Syria towards European markets. Energy politics underlie the killing, the global assassination campaign that the Obama administration is carrying on. Most Americans don't realize that Obama is carrying out the most extreme global campaign of terror in living memory, in part because the media downplay it and accept the Obama administration's flat lies that the war is winding down. We'll talk about these things tonight with help from commentaries from Ron Zoke, the first casualty, Karen Aram, voting in Thailand and Egypt, Deb Johnson, George W.'s arrest, Tony Blair's dementia, David Johnson, the cost of the war you don't see, Karen Evans-Levy, tasers, more lethal or less lethal. Our focus at Aware is on the foreign policy of the United States. What is being done in our name? And we'll begin with Ron Zook, the first casualty. Now, Ron Zook is not the first casualty, he has the first casualty in mind.
Well, this calls to mind an old saying. I don't know where it originated. The saying being that in time of war, truth is the first casualty. And this points to the passion of every government and every war-making power organization everywhere to suppress certain matters, truths you might call them, to call into question the whole idea of truth, to degrade it into the notion of your truth and my truth and so on, which is to repudiate the whole notion basically. But there were a number of books with this title, The First Casualty, going back especially to the Vietnam War and the well-known 5 o'clock follies and the briefings there by the American military about what was going on, that day's body count, and the number of casualties on the ground as we were wiping out the Viet Cong there. It has come up again, rather stark boldness in Ukraine. Who's telling the truth and who isn't? The short answer seems to be nobody is, or everybody is shading the truth to fit their own agenda. But you can make up your own mind about that. And then there's always, of course, the case of Palestine and Israel. And there is always a complaint going on. Why can't we just agree on the facts, and that will settle these matters for us, and then we'll know the truth, and that will set us free. I have some doubts about that. I think that's a rather naive view of facts and what they can do for us. But anyway, I want to refer to a very interesting article by one Keith A. Darden in the New York Times on April 27th, headlined "The War on Truth in Ukraine." He's identified as an associate professor at American University, the author of the forthcoming book, Resisting Occupation in Eurasia. He says that the reports on what is going on in Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, and Crimea have been conflicting. And how does anyone know what to believe, if anything? He says, as this has been going on, each side revved up its propaganda, and the world got another taste of confusion, uncertainty, and distortion of information that have brought this conflict to the brink. He bemoans several times the absence of legitimate authority in eastern Ukraine, and it has left an absence of transparent and agreed upon facts, a breeding ground for suspicion and manipulative diplomatic games on the margins of the truth that may yet carry the region to war. Who are the armed green men, for example, who seized towns and whose photos circulated in the media this month? Do they work for the Russians? The United States has said that Russian culpability is, quote, beyond the shadow of a doubt. The Russians have issued categorical denials. The Ukrainian government's photo evidence of involvement of Russian special forces has been undermined by apparent errors of location and misidentification, not before the images were submitted to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, endorsed by the United States State Department, and headlined in America's news media. So all of these are deeply suspicious. Doubt's shadow has not left the Ukraine, this writer says. Indeed, the failure to agree on facts, to share a basic reality, has become the norm. So this raises the question of what do you think is a fact, and what is your reality? It turns out that you're facing chaos when you start asking people these basic questions. Was it the anti-Semitic new government of the self-proclaimed Donetsk Republic that distributed the anti-Jewish flyers in Donetsk, or was this a hoax? The probability seems to be on the other side, that it was distributed by the pro-Kiev forces in order to discredit the Russian sympathizers there. Who killed 3 men at a checkpoint in Smolensk last week? Russian military intelligence or Ukrainian nationalists? If you think you have a ready, pat, and completely verifiable answer on either side of that, I'd like to talk to you.
Actually, he would like to talk to him.
Yeah.
Even deeper questions, which would have one answer in a healthy body politic with a trusted sources of information. There are many of them in Ukraine. Who killed the people on Independence Square in Kiev in last winter? Is the current government legitimate or just another armed group required to vacate public buildings under the Geneva Agreement? It depends on who you ask and where. In accounts from Western Ukraine, behind every unfortunate event lies a Russian agent. In the east and south, Ukrainian nationalist militants with Western backing are thought to pull the strings. The elusiveness of truth is a symptom and an accelerant of Ukraine's descent into uncertainty. Legitimate authority, governmental, factual, legal, and moral, is unrelentingly being effaced, and with it the chances of a peaceful outcome. So this writer is putting his hope in the restoration of legitimate authority in Ukraine, but he has nothing much to say about how that will come about. Well, in the end, he proposes that there be credible elections next month, but there's no prospect that that will actually happen. He said that he says that when Yanukovych left Kiev, repressive laws were answered with protesters' violence. In February, snipers killed more than 100 protesters and the police. By the time he was ousted, the division on February 21st, the division was clear. His removal from office was hailed in Western Ukraine as a revolution, but in the historically pro-Russian regions, it was angrily labeled a coup. Today, as authority in all forms is degraded, life becomes not only nasty, brutish, and short, in Hobbes's formulation, it becomes so riddled with disinformation and lies that there is no clear path through settlement, and the void in trust invites armed action. Healthy political systems, he says, have facts to turn to because they have trusted sources of authority. I have some doubts about that, but anyway. A president's birth records can be requested. News media, individuals, and experts can validate them. The conflicts get resolved peacefully, this says. Actually, those conflicts have never been resolved in the minds of many. Who killed Kennedy? Do you think you have the final, definitive answer to that? I mean, it should be a factual question, but there are all kinds of problems with it, apparently. The fragmentation of consensus about critical events and the degradation of legitimate political authority are like two apocalyptic horsemen riding together, he says. If there's a hope, Ukraine must restore legitimacy to its leadership and its facts. It is so. Leadership and even the facts turn out to be very much a political matter. Who do you choose to believe? The United States, Russia, Ukraine, and Europe should give it more resources and authority to provide a neutral accounting of facts, as if there could be such a thing. Ultimately, though, the ability to restore legitimate authority lies in Kiev's government's hands. Kiev seems set on doing so through force of arms, but legitimacy does not grow from the barrel of a gun. It comes through fair elections. Elections are scheduled for May 25th, but for them to be seen as fair, Kiev's leaders must better incorporate the country's south and east into the government before voting begins. If they don't, Russia might incorporate them first at the point of its own guns. So again, the question, what is truth, as jesting Pilate asked, but would not stay for an answer in the famous phrase. So we have this continuing question in the Palestine-Israel conflict. What is the truth, and what is the evidence for and against each position? And it turns out to be a very controversial matter. Who do you choose to believe? And how can we stop each side from citing some previous atrocity by the other side to justify all of their own atrocities? Is that going to lead to truth or a resolution of the conflict? I doubt it very much. So this is a rather deep question. I once saw a graduate seminar final exam in philosophy of science consisting of the sole question, are there facts? That has interesting implications. So this involves the ice cube view of facts, as I call it. Facts are cold, hard, ineluctable, and if someone doesn't believe in our facts, then we charge them with bias. And this has become the cheapest, laziest way of dismissing whatever else, whenever anyone else tells you, is simply to charge them with bias. Then they will charge you as having the opposite bias or a point of view, and so it goes. Public discussion, rational discussion of these things tends to fade quickly. So there it is. Truth is the first casualty in every war, it seems, and everyone has their own version of the facts, as we learned during the Vietnam War, and they will say that this is a fact which should determine the situation. Look at these facts, and the other side, well, no, look at these facts. And so it goes. How do we resolve that? A big problem. I'll stop there.
Yeah, Ron, I have a lot of problems with that. It seems to me that this elusiveness of truth is the last line of defense of oppressive governments. Vietnam is a good example, and everyone had their own version of the facts, you said. Well, of course, that was perfectly acceptable to the U.S. government because they said, well, we're working on our version of the facts, and no one can challenge our version of the facts because everybody has their own. When the opposition to the Vietnam War got going, it got going because Americans stood up and said, the government is lying to us. They're not doing what they say they're doing in Vietnam. They are, in fact, committing vast crimes. And by the end of the 1960s, 70% of Americans knew that, but they knew that not because the media was telling them the truth about it. In fact, the media was telling them about, oh, gee, it's elusive truth out there. What they were doing was finding out about what was going on against the government lies from other sources. That's what we're here to do. And our problem is not the elusiveness of truth, except that we need to make the effort to try to establish what the state of things is. And Ukraine, I think, is a wonderful example of it, because we've seen some of the most stupid lies from the American government on this matter that we have in a while. I usually don't want to ascribe stupidity to American lies. They're usually smarter than that. But it seems to me John Kerry's lowered the standard. The point is to say how the truth of things stand, and if we do that, then we'll understand the sort of crimes that we are responsible for because our government is committing them.
Yeah, well, one way out, of course, is the way of tenacity, or asserting, well, what I believe is the truth, and that settles the matter.
How about finding out what the facts actually are?
Yeah, well, okay.
Can I comment on what Pepe Escobar, the
Yes.
investigative journalist who just had a podcast last night I was listening to while I was doing other things, but he's very firm on this, and that, well, number one, he says that the Ukrainians, I mean, the Europeans, they don't want the Ukrainians. They don't know anything about the Ukraine. They have their own problems. The last thing they want to do is to have to support with their tax dollars this nation. He also says that, he talks also, something you had said about chaos. He talks about how, okay, one point here about chaos. He said that perpetual conflict and the fire of chaos. He said there was this was coined by a French political scientist in 2002 when he wrote a book called Empire of Chaos. And he said that, it's only in French evidently, but he said this whole thing of keeping everybody and keeping all of this chaos going so nobody really knows what's going on, it's deliberate. He also talks about how one of the things that he looks at is, he said, if you read the 1992 Defense Planning Guide, okay, and he talks about Brzezinski, he said, he quotes Brzezinski, he said, it's almost as if it was written yesterday. This came out in 92, 97. Everything is still exactly the same. He said that could have been written 1 year after the fall of the Soviet Union, the way things are progressing. And here's the part I really like about this. I've been talking a lot about the Silk Road, probably boring people to death with I even came up with a map and the lines, et cetera, et cetera. Guess what? Pepe talked about it too. And that's the first I've heard anyone else other than myself. And anytime I approach this as, does this have anything to do with anything, I get, like blank stares. And he pointed out that China is benefiting from this new alliance that they're developing with Russia. There is a lot of gas in Siberia. And the pipelines, he said the pipelines go right through the Ukraine. And the Silk Road is going to go from Xinjiang all the way to Düsseldorf. I thought it was already operating from what I had read, but evidently the Chinese simply just made this proposal to the Germans, and the Germans, they're totally in favor of it. They love it. So everything is going to be passing through the Ukraine. So these pipelines are important, as well as China's rise, okay? There's no question. Even Turkmenistan, when they talk about sanctions, and again, he was kind of laughing, and he said, there aren't a lot of sanctions that we, the U.S. or the Europe, can really impose upon Russia that's going to have that much of an impact. If they try to put sanctions on the pipelines, he said, the pipelines are owned by mostly Europeans. And he mentions English, the French, the Dutch, they own these pipelines. So there's really very little other than targeting individuals as far as their sanctions. Although I heard about one today, this morning on the News on Democracy Now, I think, or maybe it was on RT, I'm not sure. They were talking about one sanction against I think it was one oil company or something, but I'm not clear on that yet. Or maybe it was the transportation program. But he points out that there is no doubt, everyone knows, that China by 2018, anywhere between it could happen in 2017, 2020, will be the #1 economic power in the world. And he said, of course, the U.S. wants them to remain or try to be #2, but he said China's not going to do that. When they're #1, they're going to be setting the rules. And he really believes that we're looking at the end of the Bretton Woods, the policies of Bretton Woods. And that's part of the reason that you have a lot of people rising up against their governments now in Europe is because of the IMF impositions upon them and the programs of austerity. And evidently in Spain, which he claims is a real mess, they're still having a lot of demonstrations, protests, and some of them are getting violent. And he said there's almost no coverage on that. Of course, they also talked about the total lack of media coverage in the U.S. It's non-existent on these topics. But he said Europeans know. Most Europeans know, they understand what's going on and who's behind it all. So I found it really refreshing that the Silk Road, which is very important, and it's going all through Southeast Asia, and it's going through South Asia, and it's passing through the Ukraine, and this is one of the things that the U.S. is very unhappy about. Hillary Clinton evidently talked about an American Silk Road when she first became head of state, Secretary of State, and he said they just kind of laughed at her. He also said that he thinks that the TPP, he really thinks that the Europeans are going to veto it. And he said the reason they'll veto it is because it was constructed in secrecy. Nobody really knows all of what is in it. He said in Brussels, maybe 5 people in Brussels know. But he said something that's been so constructed in secret, he does not see how that can possibly fly.
Is he talking about the Pacific trade deal or the European-U.S. trade deal?
Must be the European
Yeah,
US.
that's what
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
Parallel to the Trans-Pacific Partnership
Oh,
that the Obama
okay.
administration is trying to put
Okay.
into place. Yes.
Got it, okay. So he just sees that as being, it's probably going to be vetoed by the Europeans. I mean, that's his whole point, is that the Europeans, they know what's going on, and they're not happy about it.
Led to Victoria Nuland's comment that Ron
Right.
talked about a couple of
Right.
weeks ago.
Right.
You're watching Aware on the Air. We will go on now to consider some counterfactuals with Deb Johnson, George W.'s arrest, and Tony Blair's dementia. Maybe the last isn't a counterfactual.
Well, I found this on Stop the War Coalition, and it was titled George W. Bush Taken to Court, U.S. Court for His War Crimes in Iraq. And basically, there was a lawsuit filed in California in federal court. A single Iraqi mother, a refugee, filed a lawsuit against Bush, Cheney, Powell, Rice, Rumsfeld, and Wolfowitz. And basically, her lawyer filed this because of the decisions that were made in the Nuremberg trials back in the 40s. And briefly, there was the chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, who aimed to show that German leaders committed crimes against peace, and specifically that they planned, prepared, initiated wars of aggression, which were also wars in violation of international treaties, agreements, and assurances. Jackson wrote that the tribunal, quote, ushers international law into a new era where it is in accord with the common sense of mankind, that a war of deliberate and unprovoked attack deserves universal condemnation, and its authors condign penalties. He concluded, all who have shared in this work have been united and inspired in the belief that at long last the law is now unequivocal in classifying armed aggression as an international crime instead of a national right. And this came in 1946, the tribunal's famous judgment, war is essentially an evil thing. To initiate a war of aggression, therefore, is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. So this case against Bush, which a decision will probably be made shortly, is based on the conduct of the administration prior to coming into office, as well as conduct taking place on and after 9/11. Vocal advocates of a militant neoconservative ideology that called for the United States to use its armed forces in the Middle East and elsewhere. And basically, it was filed, and there are many who believe that what Bush did was illegal under international law. It was really good to see that, you know, someone, even though it was a refugee, that ended up filing this lawsuit. So we'll all have to wait and see as to what happens with that. The other thing that I just wanted to touch on was an article that I found at the same time, Stop the War Coalition, was a speech that Tony Blair made on the Middle East. And basically, the speech was called Why the Middle East Matters, and is about a threat from radical Islam, what it consists of, and how it should be countered. Mr. Blair says that there is a titanic struggle going on within the region between those who want the region to embrace the modern world and those who instead want to create a politics of religious difference and exclusivity. On one side stand those who want pluralistic societies and open economies, and others who want to impose an exclusive Islamic ideology. Basically, the reader might suppose that Blair is building up towards some sharp criticism of Saudi Arabia and its fundamentalist Wahhabi creed, what could be more opposed to pluralism in politics and religion than a theocratic absolute monarchy such as Saudi Arabia, which is so notoriously intolerant of other versions of Islam, such as Shiism and as well as Christianity and Judaism, and is moreover the only place in the world where women are not allowed to drive a car. Here in the home country of 15 out of 19 of the 9/11 hijackers, and of them, the leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, whose religious views are rooted in mainstream Wahhabism. So basically, the speech itself didn't really make much sense at all, and people, quite frankly, laughed at this speech. And just one other thing I'd like to touch on Syria, Blair was a little bit more ambivalent about the future, though he has no doubts what we should have done. He says that in Syria, we call for the regime to change. We encourage the opposition to rise up. But when Iran activates Hezbollah on the side of Assad, we refrain even from air intervention to give the opposition a chance. Presumably by air intervention, he means a Libya-style change of regime to put the opposition in power. But in Syria, the armed opposition is dominated by the very jihadists, Jabhat al-Nusra, the official al-Qaeda affiliate, and the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, formerly al-Qaeda in Iraq, against whom Blair is warning the world. So basically, a lot of what he is saying is quite laughable, and you kind of wonder if maybe he's got a touch of dementia.
Thank you, Deb. Oh.
Dave, did you want to say something?
No. Are you biased?
And the only other thing I would like to say is today is International Dance Day. So maybe everybody do a little dance under the full moon tonight. And I just want to say that I attended the film festival, the Roger Ebert Film Festival, for the first time. And it was wonderful. And I highly recommend that you see a movie that was filmed in Saudi Arabia by a woman, which was pretty amazing stuff. In fact, she spoke of having to film sometimes in her car because women are not allowed to be in public with men. So the story itself is wonderful. The movie is called Wajda, I believe. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right.
I think that's right, yeah.
But it was about a little girl who wanted a bicycle. And little girls aren't allowed to ride bicycles in Saudi Arabia. And so she had, the movie is just wonderful, and I highly recommend that if you get a chance to watch it, because it's very worthwhile.
Thank you very much, Deb. I think you illustrated at the beginning the point of Ron's observation, and war, the first casualty is truth, the reason being that ex-prime ministers lie about it. And we have this amazing speech by Tony Blair that you described, a man who is largely responsible for a million deaths in Iraq, lying about how this war came about and how it will continue. And their truth is lying on the ground along with the corpses at that point. You're watching Aware on the Air. We have a number of people with other things to say. I want to go back to Karen with some talk about voting in Egypt and Thailand. But let's first go to David Johnson with a comment on the cost of the war you do not see.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to comment on Deborah's, it's interesting about Tony Blair's, speech in that Saudi Arabia is the most repressive country in the Middle East, if not the world. However, what forgives everything is open markets. What's that mean? That means basically that the U.S. and Britain and the other capitalist countries will forgive everything as long as they have an open capitalist economy that allows multinational corporations to be able to come and go as they please and rape and plunder the economy and the people's cheap wages whenever possible. So I think that's very telling about what the real priorities are, what the real objectives are of our current governments. But yes, I'd like to talk about the cost of the war you don't see. I think this goes back to the media, as Carl was mentioning earlier, and Ron. What's interesting about the media today as compared to the media during the Vietnam War was that during the Vietnam War, we saw the war in our living rooms, in our televisions. Reporters were allowed pretty much free access, and they interviewed, they took footage of actual battles and interviewed the soldiers right there. And there was a lot of things said on American television at that time by U.S. soldiers that wasn't very flattering of either the leadership in the White House or the war itself. It also showed some very graphic images of just the reality of the war. Well, it's funny because a lot of people say that our government didn't learn anything from Vietnam. I say they learned the wrong lessons in the sense that in more recent times, they've learned to control what the American people see. You ask the average person on the street now, they don't even, it's just, they don't even know there's a war going on anywhere except maybe Afghanistan. And even then, it's not like, unless you have a son or daughter, niece or nephew, or brother or sisters in the military, it really doesn't affect most people's lives, but it does. It does affect your life. It affects it indirectly. There's the moral costs of most of the countries, or most of the peoples of the world hating our government, not the leaders necessarily, but the people who are adversely affected by this. There's the innocent lives lost that were needlessly wasted, including women and children, old people. There's the our taxpayer support of brutal regimes around the world. And then, of course, there's the whole thing of loss of liberty at home, because these wars are used, the excuse of them is to basically shred our Bill of Rights and institute laws that are just totally, that goes counter to our Constitution and the foundation of this country. But then there's, a lot of times people not necessarily affected by, what's in their heart, but let's go to their wallet, because this is having a real effect on the average American indirectly as far as their wallet, if you will. There's the economic cost, trillions of dollars since 2003 when the invasion of Iraq occurred. There's all sorts of benefits to this for the rich people. The ones who make money off of war. But as far as the average working person out there, the 99%, the economic benefits have not been there. It's actually cost us economically. It's cost us in the form of higher taxes. It's cost us as far as just basically underfunded schools and public services. It's cost us as far as out of control healthcare and university costs, which have made healthcare and university attendance for the average working person just unattainable. There's the whole lack of high-speed rail and cheap alternative energy that could benefit us. All this money being spent on weapon systems could be turned around to help create cheaper, better energy alternatives for the average American. There's also the deteriorating physical infrastructure in this country, bridges, roads, dams, levees, that, if you've seen any reports of various outlets, PBS included, to where there's a dangerous level of deteriorating levees in this country. Similar to what happened in Katrina back some odd decade ago. There's the overpriced and underperforming internet and cell phones in this country compared to what the Europeans and many of the Asians have. There's our general falling standard of living, which is fastly approaching third world levels. And last but not least, there's the environmental damages that are caused by war. This is just, unacceptable. It should be unacceptable, but for the average American, since we're not being informed of the facts of the media, instead we're actually disinformed. Facts are suppressed, and various methods of distraction are used in the media. I mean, basically covering just irrelevant local sensational stories about a triple murder somewhere in Mississippi, or the latest celebrity fluff piece about what's going on with pick your star. This is just this is what we have to realize, and this is why it's so important that more people like us need to go public and do your research, go on the internet. Don't believe what you see on corporate television. I mean, I'm not saying it's all lies, but most of it is, and you need to go on the internet. That is what's left of it, because there's a threat to the internet as we know it now from censorship. But while we've got it, let's use it and learn the facts so that you could be an informed citizen and demand of our elected officials that we stop this insane policy.
Thank you very much, David. Comments, ladies and gentlemen?
It was very good and very
The question
true.
is not so much that often that they're lying, but they're leaving out a whole lot of things that might be very interesting and relevant.
Suppression of truth, yes.
Yeah, well, a case this week. The pictures you will find on RT, Russian television, about what's going on in western Ukraine. There is a picture there of neo-Nazis parading in Lvov in honor of the Ukrainian SS division that was formed in World War II to fight the Russians. And there are some what are called ultra-nationalists there now who are celebrating this. And it begins to wonder, how justified are the Russian people in eastern Ukraine about wanting to break away from Kiev and the people in eastern Ukraine. And it puts a very different light on things that are happening there.
Right, and we don't
mean,
get that here.
Am I turned around, or have you got that the other way around?
I may have reversed it,
Right.
I'm not sure. But western
But the point,
Ukraine is governed nominally by Kiev.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the Russian sympathizers in eastern Ukraine are the ones that the U.S. government is condemning as
Right.
prelude to a Russian invasion.
Yeah, yeah.
And it is important to note, as you do, John Pilger pointed out in an article that we distributed last weekend, that really for the first time since the Second World War, there is a anti-Semitic government in Europe. And that is the Western Ukraine, the Kiev government, that the U.S. seems to have been instrumental in putting into place against an elected president, by the way. So these calls for we need credible elections shouldn't ignore the fact that we had them.
Yeah, well, this has become a standard gimmick now of both sides accusing the other of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
We've seen that locally going on, and it's standard fare now. It's happening in Ukraine, where, again, each side accuses the other of anti-Semitism, and they're producing bogus documents to try to support
It's
this.
basically a propaganda war.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
I've read that, both sides are guilty of it,
Yes.
and you don't know what to believe. It's kind of, and that's the whole point, isn't it? To keep the truth.
You have to construct something for yourself that you think is reasonably well justified.
The task is
Right.
to find out what actually is going on. I mean,
Yeah.
Right,
it's the
right.
constructions that are
Can't
part of the
assume
problem.
it's propaganda on both. We can't assume it's propaganda on both sides. But
We have a section scheduled to bring it all back home and talk about the use of firepower here in Urbana.
no, I
Beg
think
pardon?
I'm going to talk now. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, she's.
all right. So instead,
Okay.
we'll go to Karen Aram to talk
Egypt.
about not home,
you going to
but
dance
Thailand
to
and
celebrate?
Egypt,
Okay.
unless Thailand happens to be your home.
Okay, I'm not going to talk about Thailand now. I'll save that for next time. It's related to much of what we're talking about. But I'm going to focus on Egypt because what is happening right now is very important. This government that we are supporting with taxpayer dollars, okay, they had a coup. Technically, we are not supposed to support a government that is being ruled by a military dictatorship when a coup occurs, but we're still sending them aid. And I mention this because last month, 529 people were condemned to death. Now, due to massive campaigns against that judgment, a judge, they called for another review, and the judge upheld the death sentence for 37 of those people, while the rest were sentenced to life in prison. Now, however, another 683 people have been sentenced to death, okay? These are people who were protesters, okay? It's absolutely outrageous. Secretary Kerry is there now meeting with the government of Egypt. Now, I posted a phone number of his office in DC on Facebook. I'm sorry I neglected to bring it, but we really need to inundate the State Department with emails, with letters, with phone calls, urging them we have to stop supporting this kind of a dictatorship. And I also want to point out that the Egyptian Socialist Party has come out and urged people to vote in the upcoming elections. And while they respect the rationale of many people who are preferring to boycott the elections, because they know al-Sisi, the military leader, they know that what he's been doing will probably, so they're just going to boycott the election. But the Socialist Party is coming out and saying, please don't do that. Please vote for his opponent, something like Sahibi, because we really need to take votes away from al-Sisi. We really need to prove and show the things that he's been doing and the facade under which he's operating. And so, when the Socialist Party comes out and urges people to please vote in the upcoming election, I think this is very important. And I will relate it to voting here within the U.S. as well as voting for a new party that is coming up and taking place in Thailand. And it is all related. Egypt, like Thailand, the U.S. is behind the scenes. And our taxpayer dollars are going to support the atrocities that are being committed. So I would urge people to write to the State Department, either email them or blitz them with phone calls. Now, I did call the Egyptian embassy, but I called too late one time and got the janitor. But if you call during the day, well, he took my message. He said he would deliver the message, but it was clear yeah.
Maybe the best way to do it.
But it's better to do it in the daytime. But inundate them. Inundate, whether it's the Egyptian embassy or whether I prefer the State Department, because again, we're responsible for supporting with our taxpayer dollars this military regime, and even though we're going against our own laws. Okay.
Thank you very much, Karen. Comments? Correct me if I'm wrong. A lot of these parties, in fact, advised abstention during the election that produced President Morsi, right?
Right. Well, maybe. I'm not even sure about that.
I know at least some did.
Right.
I don't know whether the one
Right.
you were speaking of did
but
or
what
not.
the Socialist Party is urging, because the Socialist Party is saying, look, it has to be proven that al-Sisi is nothing more than the same Mubarak
Right.
administration, the same people.
Supported by the United States,
Right.
that supported Mubarak.
Exactly. And
part
so
of the arrangement, yes.
By giving your vote to his opponent and giving them the opportunity to speak out and to prove what a facade the election actually is, and that this government that took over actually
Perennial
is.
dilemma. Do you vote in cases like that, or do you boycott? And if you do vote, that tends to lend some legitimacy to the government and what's
Right,
going on.
right.
But if you don't, that won't help anyone at all. So it's a terrible dilemma, and I wouldn't want to moralize with anyone else about how they chose to
Yeah, and let's
do
not
it.
even talk about, rigged
yes.
elections. I mean, what about, how are they voting? Are they voting electronically? I mean,
I don't know
because-
anything about the mechanisms.
Yeah.
I only know what
Yeah.
the Revolutionary Socialist Party in Egypt, is requesting of their own people. And I wanted to relate it to a new party that is taking place in Thailand. And what is interesting about this is being urged because the current party, that I've only been telling the good things, how they help the poor with microfinancing and they help bring about various health care under Thaksin. But the fact is they still cater to the military. They're afraid to speak out against a law of least majest, which prevents all communication or discourse against the establishment, the military, the monarchy. They're, as I've said before, They are not supporting their own people who have been incarcerated. So a new party is coming up, and the formation of this new party is called the Common People Party of Thailand. And their demands are very progressive, both politically and economically. And I won't go through all of that now, but I just want to point something out. We think of Thailand right now, given the fact that you've got people in the streets protesting against democracy, as being very, very archaic, and they are. But in the past, and this is the new leader of this new party, he said in the past we used to have similar parliamentary parties such as the Socialist Party of Thailand and other left-wing parties. Their policies focused on challenging inequality. They were founded in 1974, and in 75 the party won 18 seats in parliament. Now the leader was killed in the 1976 massacre, which I refer to frequently because I'm sure that our government was involved in that. And that was the end, that was the beginning of the dark age that Thailand entered. And that was the beginning of, you never talked about socialist parties or communist parties there in Thailand ever again, because, and that massacre is pretty much wiped out of Thai history. But that's also because in 1975 we lost the war in Vietnam. And you had the student activists were calling for US military bases to be taken out of Thailand, and they won seats in parliament. So this is what happened. But again, they're starting to form a new party, and I'm hoping that Thai people will support them, because the one that they have is just not.
Did I understand you? There were masses of people protesting in the streets against democracy?
Recently,
That's
yes.
the way they.
Yes.
Yes.
No, seriously, and
Presented
it's
it,
been
yes,
on.
yeah.
It has been presented here on the media. The corporate media here has actually presented that. As I said, it's
course they
positively
do.
archaic. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But yeah, those are the people that support the establishment. Okay.
That's what the
Yeah.
U.S. has organized in Venezuela. The demonstrations you hear about in the evening news in Venezuela are demonstrations against democracy, that is, against a democratically elected government. Remember, of course, the demonstrations organized in Kiev by the United States were demonstrations against democracy. A democratically elected government wasn't a very attractive government. Yanukovych in Kiev. Maduro's government in Venezuela, an inheritance of the, who in sense inherited Chavez's party, is also democratically elected, and the demonstrations there are against democracy and are also being encouraged actively by the United States. This is what the Obama administration is doing around the world, and it's consistent with American policy literally over generations. That's a truth about war that the American people do not know
Right.
and need to be told. You are listening to Aware on the Air, where we try to resuscitate the first casualty of war. And we will bring it all back home and with questions of resuscitation and tasers. Right, Karen?
Sure.
The question is, are tasers more lethal or less lethal?
That is a really good question. I want to talk a little bit about the Urbana police asking for tasers to be added to their arsenal. Right now, neither the Urbana police nor the Champaign police own tasers, but they do have access to tasers through the sheriff's office and through the University of Illinois police. Urbana now wants their own, and Champaign will follow it. Let me first clearly state my personal bias. I am an active member of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, and also with Occupy Champaign-Urbana. I actively demonstrate in the streets against war, against U.S. foreign policies, and for civil rights, for peace, and for the rights of workers, unions, and for environmental issues, and for immigrant rights. I'm on the street a lot. On the taser issue, I went to the public library to do some research on tasers. I am still actively doing research at the academic libraries, but let me mention my amazement at what I discovered at the public library. The public library has access to non-academic periodicals. Law enforcement magazines are in the collection online. I read testimony after testimony from police departments in praise of tasers. Over and over, the stories are about the use of tasers in situations where the police would never use a gun. Digressing. Local supporters of tasers claim that the tasers would be used instead of guns, a less lethal weapon. They are not non-lethal, they are just less lethal. Reading testimonies from police, they tell stories of using a taser in situations where they never would have pulled a gun. They talk about subduing inmates already in jail. They talk about subduing someone in a room where there's hard walls and an untidy room. They talk about using tasers in crowds. They talk about using a taser as they are trying to handcuff a person who's resisting. They repeatedly talk about using the taser instead of communication, instead of physical force like grabbing the person, and they most likely talk, and they mostly talk about subduing a non-compliant person. When a person doesn't respond to down on your knees and shut up. The reason police don't want to use physical force is because it leaves marks on the person's body. The person can later claim that the police used excessive force. Tasers are not a step down from guns. They are a step away from problem solving, a step away from police work, a step towards controlling the public, a step away from any skills, a step toward getting people to comply. Tasers are a power tool. I participate in peaceful street demonstrations, candlelight vigils, unity marches. I participate here in Urbana, in Champaign, and on campus. Police have stopped to talk to us. Some have been poorly informed as to our rights to free speech and to peacefully assemble. Some have attempted to disperse us, remove us, to collect our names for their database and tell us we are breaking the law. Because they were alone, they were unable to accomplish their goals. So they called for backup. The officers were then informed by better informed officers that we were within our rights and were told, and the police officer was told to stand down. The police officers confronting us were angry and scared of a group of people. I never thought we were in danger of a gun being pulled on us, but if a taser had been readily available, I have no doubt it would have been used on us instead of the officer calling for advice. I would have a police record today. What happens after a person is tased? We know that tasers are non-lethal. We must ask, are tasers less lethal than guns, or are they more lethal than de-escalation skills? Will tasers be used to de-escalate or to escalate, or both?
Thank you, Karen.
Very good, Karen.
Tasers are supposedly non-lethal, but in some cases they have been, I believe. What it does is fires this thing at you, puts two electrodes into you, and then there's an electric arc between them that disables people and leaves them convulsing on the ground in most cases.
But their muscles stop contracting at all, and so they do collapse. So there are heart issues, and people with heart, they've been looking at that, but there are also concerns of eye issues, like people's eyes have been hurt and other medical things. So a lot of people are bringing up those issues, but they're not. Some of the research that I'm doing at the academic libraries is actually on the psychological and the social issues that are involved in it, because everybody keeps bringing up the biological, and everybody cites papers back and forth, and most of the Taser International funds a lot of research, but then publishes them in academic journals. But all those academic journals are not like the AMA. They're like the 5th tier journals, and then they cite them and say, oh, see, we were peer reviewed and our research is valid and all that stuff. And really all it does is support their, I'm sorry, we only have a few minutes. But
Aren't tasers banned in Canada?
Yes.
Thank you. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 18th week of 2014. Thanks to Jason Liggett and Yosef Kosh for direction and production, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ron Zook, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, Deb Johnson, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.